Welcome to this special admissions edition of the Office Hours. My name is Dan Parish. I'm the Director of Admissions Recruitment here at Dartmouth, and I'm joined by Maria Laskaris, who is the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid. Tonight we are going to answer your questions about the application process, and we're going to offer tips on what you should do and what you should follow as you plan to submit your application over the next, hopefully over the next few days. So let's start there. You should know that the application deadline is January 1st. You have advice you want to give on what they should do to get to January 1st and still be feeling healthy and awake and not stressed out about this? Sure,
great question. As Dan said, I'm Maria Laskaris, Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid, so welcome and thank you for joining us. First of all, don't panic. You do have 10 days. With the Common App Online, you can hit the submit button January 1st, and it'll get to us in plenty of time. So I'd suggest, take the next 10 days, kind of clear your head. Most of you probably are finishing school today, maybe tomorrow.
Right.
I'm sure your teachers have given you lots of homework. No one's letting up on you just because you're a senior. So take a day or two, kind of clear your head, gather your thoughts, and then just polish it off. I'm sure you're pretty close anyway, so it's just a matter of finding a little time to kind of get that time and space away from school and just put the finishing touches.
And I'm sure most of you all attend schools that have already required you to meet certain deadlines for them, your high school guidance office, your college counseling office, your teachers. But for those of you who still have a school day left tomorrow, just make sure that you've done everything that your high school has asked you to do. And don't panic if you haven't. If we get back here on January 3rd, when we arrive back from after the holidays on January 3rd, we'll still have materials coming in. If there's something you need to check in with about at your school, you'll have the chance to do that. So the first two questions, let's start with how can I be sure that my transcript reached the admissions office? Let's start with that.
Sure. We have something that we call our online applicant services. So as soon as you send one part of your application, we will open a file for you, and you will receive an email from us with information on our online applicant services. It's password protected, so you'll get a login and a PIN, and you can go to the website and check to see which materials have been received. As Dan said, we're going to get a lot of mail over the next 2 weeks, and once we get back from the to the office January 3rd. So it may take us a while to actually dig through the submissions, both the online and the paper. So as Dan said, don't panic, but we will provide you with the tools that you can just on a regular basis check to see if your materials have made it to our office.
For the first, during early January, the online applicant services page will just have a message that says, thank you for your application. We're working really hard to get everything entered and indexed and get it all squared away. And we will post an incomplete message later in January or as we get to February. So don't worry if you haven't heard the specifics from us. As long as you have an acknowledgement from us, you know that we're building your application file, we're working on it, we're taking care of it. And then once we know that we've had the chance to process most everything we've received, at that point, we'll send a message out, late January, early February that will tell you, okay, here's what we're missing. We've had a few problems. Let's follow up. And usually everything you've sent gets to us. We do this. We do this a lot. We receive a lot of information. We have really good systems in place to catch this. So one of the questions is about what we think might be the most important component of the application. So what do you tell people when they say, what's the key thing? What's the most important part?
Well, the answer is that every part is important, but I think you have a chance to just start it off with your own essay and the information that you want to tell us. Most of you are probably thinking about, I need to finish the essay, want to polish it off, or maybe you haven't started yet, so maybe that's a great place to start with the essay. It is an opportunity for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, some of the things that you think are most important, things that you'd like us to know about your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, your accomplishments. Things that have been challenging for you. Pretty much anything goes. But really what we want to hear we want to hear from you. We want to get to know you a little bit before we delve into your transcript and recommendations and your test scores. Your part is probably one of the most important parts. And Dan, you've also read a lot of essays and you might have some thoughts that you want to share on that as well.
And I always say that the single most important part of the application depends a little bit on you. Your strengths, your weaknesses, your perspective, those are the things that are going to rise up and grab our attention. So for some of you, there may be one part of the application that becomes more critical and more crucial than for somebody else because it represents a real strength, a real opportunity, or maybe the liability in your application that makes us want to go back and read other things. Most students who apply to Dartmouth are successful high school students who've taken challenging courses and done well. That's the key to being in the mix in the applicant pool. If you've done that, you've challenged yourself at a high level and you've done well, then everything else in your application can start to become more or less important depending on you. And it might be that your essay grabs somebody's attention. We want to ask more questions about that. It might be that talent that you have. It might be the energy that comes across in your recommendations. For each of you, it's going to be something a little bit different. We started off talking about the deadlines, and somebody's asked just generally, how strict are we about the deadlines? How stringent are we? And as I mentioned at the beginning, your part of the application should be filed on time. You've got time to do that. Most of you will file it online through the Common Application website. But we do understand that there are pieces of the application that are out of your control. So we know that something might happen with your secondary school report arriving, and it might arrive late. That's okay. A teacher recommendation might arrive late. So we understand that things may be coming in over time. If it's mailed internationally or sent through the mail and can't be sent online, that there may be a delay there. We understand that. That said, the deadline's there for a reason. We want you to do what you can to meet the deadline, but you can only control what you can control, and we understand that. So Dreaming Green has asked us a question. How do you understand each student's context in terms of classes, finances, etc., all those things that sort of determine where somebody's coming from and influences their application? How do we get at that?
Well, that gets really to the art of what we do in admissions. We want very much to understand you as an individual, and for us to do that, we do look at what we call the context of your home environment, your school environment, the community in which you're living and working and going to school. And that really helps us appreciate the opportunities that you've had, how you've taken advantage of, have you taken advantage of those opportunities, and also perhaps some of the things that you haven't had available to you and what you've done instead of, or because of the fact that you haven't been able to pursue one avenue or the other. So we'll take a look right off the bat, starting from the first part of your application. You will tell us a little bit about your family background. Did your parents go to college? Do you have siblings? Did they go to college? Are they younger? You'll tell us a little bit about the school that you attend. We'll know from your high school profile a little bit about the high school. Again, who else is in that school with you? What are their aspirations in terms of college or post-secondary school opportunities? And that will help us appreciate a little bit about who you are as an individual, and again, the opportunities, the resources. And then as we look at your essays, your transcripts, your grades, your recommendations, we'll get a sense of how you as an individual took advantage of the opportunities and resources that have been available to you right there. And we recognize that all students will have very different kinds of opportunities or different kinds of contexts that they're coming from. So that's really one of the first things we try to do and one of the fundamental things we do in evaluating your application.
Right. And our goal is to try to understand how you've used the resources available to you. And at its most basic level, your high school profile. And most of you attend schools that will send us a profile that just give us a good basic set of what opportunities do you have in the school, how are courses labeled, what's the community like. We'll try to get at that. So just a question from B in Miami that I'll try to answer quickly. Some of you may be QuestBridge students. Dartmouth is a QuestBridge partner, and somebody's asking if it's okay to reuse the QuestBridge essays for the Common Application. And it is okay. We recognize that students who've been through the QuestBridge process may have put a lot of work into their QuestBridge application, and we recognize that you may reuse that. You don't have to reuse them. You can use a new essay if you've got a new essay, but if not, we're not going to require that you submit a new one. We got a couple questions about the peer evaluation. So Dreaming Green again asks us what we're looking for in the peer evaluation. Johnson asks whether an adult can fill out the peer evaluation form. And let me just start with Johnson's question. In general, our advice around the peer evaluation, a lot of times people will ask, oh, is it okay for my sister to write it, or my cousin, my friend who doesn't go to school with me? All of those are perfectly appropriate. In general, my advice about the peer evaluation is that it should come from somebody you consider a peer. And that's generally going to be somebody who's an age peer, but not somebody who's an adult presence in your life. So, somebody you work with who's a few years older, that's great, that's fine. But usually not from somebody who's more of a parent figure or an adult figure.
Right. I think what we're trying to get from the peer evaluation, and I think I saw a question just go past us in terms of what are you looking for from the peer evaluation. We want to get a sense of who you are. Let's say I was your classmate or your roommate, or I was on a team with you, or I went on a Dartmouth outing club trip with you as a trippy. So I want to get a sense of you as a person, but as someone who I could see perhaps, again, sharing this Dartmouth experience with on a day-to-day basis. So that's why we're looking, as Dan said, for someone who's an age peer. It doesn't mean that you can't have someone a little bit older or younger, but in general, I think we prefer someone who's close in age, again, just to get that sense of you as a real friend, person, classmate, colleague, etc.
Quick practical question. Can the peer evaluation be submitted electronically? It can be. Your peer can submit it via email. There's on the Dartmouth Admissions website, there's some advice about submitting application materials. Probably some of our chatters can post the link to that on the chat. There's a special email address for processing applications that can be sent to. So if your peer wants to submit it via email, they can do that. Can I submit supplements after I send in my application? The short answer to that is yes. You can continue to send information. And again, on the Dartmouth Admissions website, there's some advice about how you should send those and to where you should send things like that. Let's talk a little bit about what you might mean by supplements. Yeah. So do you want to start just briefly talk about the art supplement and how we evaluate that?
I think we've got, I guess, 3 sort of official supplements. One would be the art supplement, one would be a supplement if you're a homeschool student, and one is a supplement if you're an international student. And there, as Dan was suggesting, there are other kinds of supplements that you might send in terms of updates to your application. But let's talk about, first of all, the art supplement, which is probably one of the most common supplements that students submit along with their Dartmouth application. It's fine to send that after the deadline, but again, I think if you can get it to us as close as possible in early January to the deadline, that's really, I think, to your advantage, because what we will do is once we've received the information, obviously want to match it up with your whatever CD or whatever materials you've sent along with that paper supplement to make sure we get those out to the appropriate academic department. So our music faculty, our studio art faculty, our theater faculty, dance, film and television studies, computer science. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple, but many faculty members have volunteered to help us evaluate these materials. So we'd like to get the materials to the faculty in a very timely manner so that they can then get their evaluations back to us, and then we can fold that into our evaluation. So I think if you can get those materials to us, I would say within the first 2 to 3 weeks of January, that would be terrific. If you start getting into mid to late February, that really does become too late. It's too late for our faculty to really do a thoughtful evaluation, and then it really gets too late in terms of our own decision-making process. So we get a lot of art supplements. We encourage students to send those if they are things that represent a real interest, something they'd like to continue to pursue here at Dartmouth. Our faculty are very eager to evaluate materials. But again, within the first 2 or 3 weeks of January would be ideal. Yeah.
And then there are a number of questions just coming up in the chat about sort of supplemental information in general. And one is whether it makes sense to send in an additional essay explaining why you'd want to go into a specific major. There's another one that asks, since Dartmouth's supplement is the peer evaluation and we don't have a special supplemental essay, somebody's asking, how do I stand out if there's no special supplemental essay? And just as an initial answer to that, one thing you should keep in mind is that on the Common Application, not specific to Dartmouth, but on the Common Application, there is that part that says, look, is there anything else you want to tell us? So if there is some specific piece that you want to be sure that we understand, your well-developed interest in a particular academic area, a research project that you weren't able to explain elsewhere, use that part of the Common Application for that. My advice around that is to be concise. You don't write paragraphs and paragraphs. Don't make it longer than a standard Common Application essay, but a couple of paragraphs, 200, 300, 400 words about something that's a special interest is perfectly appropriate. And Dartmouth doesn't have a supplemental essay. We don't ask you why Dartmouth is your first choice. We're really looking for the common application to give you a chance to shine. Your peer evaluation, the recommendation, the other pieces of the application will come together. The one last piece about the specific major question is that when we read applications, we're not admitting you into a major at Dartmouth. And often we don't notice what major you might want to pursue here unless it really has an impact on your case. You love classics, it's what you've loved your whole life, you want to major in it, that will come out of your application. But if you happen to be undecided or you've checked 3 majors, don't worry about it. We know that students will come to Dartmouth and make some choices about that once they get here. So let's see. Sydney's wondering about the SAT subject tests or SAT 2 scores. How heavily are they weighed in the application process? So what do you want to tell people about testing and subject tests?
Let's talk in general about testing. It's probably the bane of everybody, every high school senior's existence at the moment. We take testing as one of the many pieces of information that we're going to collect about you or on your behalf. And it is a part of our process, but we are not making our decisions based on your test scores. High test scores do not guarantee admission. Right. Low test scores do not doom you to never being admitted to a place like Dartmouth. It's just a part of the composite picture that we put together of you. The reality is that most students who apply to Dartmouth actually test pretty well. Right. And our definition of pretty well is pretty broad. And if you go to our website, you'll see that we admit students with a range of scores, because we don't think scores alone are the only thing that predict a student's ability to be a successful and contributing member of this community. So perhaps we can put some, we can point you to information on our website where you can see the range of scores of our admitted student group. But I think that should give you a sense that they're part of the process, but they are certainly not drivers of our decision. And specific to SAT 2s, we allow you to use the score choice option and ask you to select whichever 2 SAT 2s you'd like to send to us. And I would think you'd want to send us what you think are your strongest subjects. But again, it's just one piece of data that is a part of the overall picture we're trying to put together of you. And again, most of our applicants tend to do pretty well across all of these academic measures. Right.
And we have, keep in mind that we have 3 to 3.5 years of your high school transcript in front of us. So testing in general is held up against that, can be compared back and forth, can help sort of supplement and support what we know. And the subject tests in particular can really, maybe give us a little more well-rounded picture of what that grade on the transcript might be, might contradict it or kind of contrast back and forth a little bit. So we've got a question about alumni interviewing. So the question from in the chat is, does every student get an interview? What should I do if an alumnus has not yet contacted me? Am I at a disadvantage if I don't get an interview? So let me just try to briefly address some of the practical things around alumni interviewing. We don't reach every student in terms of offering an alumni interview. We try really hard to reach as many students as we can. Typically 60 to 70% or 50 to 60%, excuse me, of students who apply are interviewed. We use the interview similar to what Maria said about testing. It's one piece of many in the application. So it's another piece that gives us another perspective on who you are. If we're trying to answer the question, what might the student bring to Dartmouth? What are their biggest strengths and weaknesses? What stands out? The interview is one other piece that helps us round that out. It's typically the last piece that we look at in an application. And we understand that we don't have volunteers everywhere and we can't reach every student. So we recognize that not every student will have the chance to have an interview. And we track that pretty carefully and work pretty hard to make sure that students aren't at a disadvantage by not having the interview. I don't know, what else would you say about the interview?
Yeah, I think just to underscore that you are not at a disadvantage if you don't have one. And I think of it similar to the peer evaluation. It's another perspective on you as a person from someone who probably doesn't do a lot of recommendation writing or tons and tons of interviewing, although a lot of our interviewers are very experienced at interviewing, but it is a very fresh perspective on your candidacy. One of the things that's, I think, hardest for us who've been doing this admissions work for a long time is that we rarely get a chance to meet the applicants face-to-face. And, we very much, when we read an essay, we read something about you that really piques our curiosity, we really can't pick up the phone or send you a text message and say, hey, can we talk about this? But I think an interview is an opportunity for someone who is very familiar with Dartmouth and very much in tune with what it is that we're trying to do as we put together a student body year in and year out to say, you know what, I know that Dartmouth really likes kids who have this kind of passion or interest, or who have these interesting experiences. So tell me more about it. I think oftentimes, you know, when you're writing your own essays, my perspective is that students tend to stop a little bit short from really delving into the details. They tend to put together very well crafted essays, but many times just don't take that extra step of telling us why they've chosen this topic, or why they've taken this opportunity. And a good interview, or a good peer evaluation, or a good recommendation from a teacher or counselor, those are the places where we learn the why, not just what you did, but why you've made those decisions. So that's why I like interviews and peer evaluations and even recommendations, because they help give us some texture to all the things that you've done.
Another quick point on supplements, since we're not too far away from that. One student asked if it's okay to send in an art supplement even though you're planning on pursuing another major like biology. Absolutely. Again, we're not admitting you into a major, and we recognize that there are a lot of students who apply to Dartmouth who have a passion for music, for vocal performance, for the arts, who may want to continue to pursue that at a really high level here, but may end up majoring in something else. So part of what that art supplement does for you is allows you to show us what you've invested your time in and what the talents you've gained from that. So that's perfectly appropriate. Quick practical question: what % of the class was filled through early decision?
This year it was just about 40%. And for the last several years, we've been anywhere from 35 to 40%. So it's tough. I mean, we've seen our early decision applicant pool grow pretty substantially, and a lot of really terrific students who've identified Dartmouth as their clear first choice, and we'd like to respond to that. But we also know that the majority of our applicants will wait until January 1st, and that's perfectly appropriate. We recognize that you will have a lot of great choices, and so recognize that you're not ready to make that binding commitment. So we do all that we can to preserve enough places so that we can also admit lots of terrific students who weren't ready to make that binding commitment to Dartmouth. So about 40% this year, and but lots of space for all the terrific students out there who are applying regularly.
Right. There's a question about the role of AP test scores in admissions decisions, and if you share your AP scores with us, we will factor them into our consideration. And in some ways, similar to the SAT subject tests, they help confirm that you've mastered a certain body of material, that you performed at a high level and done well. And so we factor that into our decision. We recognize that there are many students in our applicant pool who won't have AP scores to share at this point, and that's why we require the subject tests and the SAT reasoning test or the ACT and not the AP scores. But if you have AP scores to share or international baccalaureate scores to share, we'll factor that into what we know about you. We've got your transcript, we've got your required test scores, and those will help. NITSTA is asking how can I show that Dartmouth is my top choice?
Right. Well, I guess a couple ways you might approach that. As Dan mentioned earlier, the Common Application provides a section that just says additional information, and you're certainly welcome to put some information there if you feel so inspired. An interview is another opportunity. When an interview might say, so how did you learn about Dartmouth? What appeals to you about Dartmouth? I mean, there are opportunities for you throughout the process to share that information. I think it's really important for you to realize, though, that we know that you're going to have a lot of great choices. Right. So we are not basing our admissions decision on the students who've contacted us the most or have visited us the most or send us lots of information that says Dartmouth is my first choice. We hope that every student who applies to Dartmouth is thinking that Dartmouth is one of their top choices. And believe me, once we admit you, we're going to do all that we can to get you to choose Dartmouth. So the fact that you're in our applicant pool, we take as a sign of your serious interest in Dartmouth. So don't feel that you have to go to great lengths to convince us that you would like to attend Dartmouth. We believe that if you've applied, that you are considering Dartmouth as one of the schools that you can see yourself at. We recognize that you'll have a lot of great choices, though, and so we know we've got our work cut out for us once we've admitted you to convince you to come to Dartmouth. But let us do that. You worry about your essay, and let us take it from there. Right, and
those of us who read admissions applications don't know about your history with Dartmouth when we read, and we shouldn't. We don't track your contact in that way. We really think if you've invested the time in the application, we should respect that. We should admit bright, high-achieving, fun people who are going to really engage with this campus. And on the other end of it, as Maria said, we want to convince you that this is really a special place. So we recognize that we have some pressure on us to show you how special Dartmouth is once we've admitted students. How much are teacher recommendations weighed? How are they factored into the process, and particularly compared to the essays that students write?
Yeah. Again, the essay, that's your chance to speak to the admissions staff very directly about something of importance to you. I think teacher recommendations really help us see you as a student in a particular school, a classroom, a community. It gives us a sense of what kind of student you are. And the neat thing about Dartmouth, both Dan and I are Dartmouth alums, and so we can speak from our own experience, although it's been a while for me and not so long for you. But this is a place that welcomes students from all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of interests, all different kinds of approaches to their learning. So you may be the most talkative and outgoing student who's always raising his or her hand and is always ready at that moment with something really interesting to contribute. Or you could be the person who kind of sits back and takes it all in, kind of processes the information, and then comes out with that zinger that everyone just says, wow, this is a really smart person. So I think it's really important for you to realize that at Dartmouth there is room for all kinds of students, wherever you fit on that spectrum. And the teacher recommendation just helps us see you as the student in the classroom. What kind of a student are you? What are the things that you like to do? How do you approach your learning? They help us put your grades in context as well, because probably no surprise, most students who apply to Dartmouth have done well in the classroom. And so if we just were to look at your grades and your scores, we couldn't tell you apart for the most part. And so a teacher helps us personalize the grades to say, you know what, so you're looking at a B in this AP Stats course. You know what? This was the second highest grade in the course. I'm a really tough grader. So a good teacher recommendation really helps us contextualize your transcript as well as help us understand you as a unique individual, not a set of grades, not a set of courses, but as a person who is engaged in the learning process. So that's what I'm looking for, you know, when I'm looking at a recommendation. Right.
We've got a question from Average Guy. I like that. I like that screen name. So how is the intended major taken into account, and how much does it matter? And as I mentioned earlier, at Dartmouth, we're not admitting you into a major when we admit you. And one of the things we've learned about students who apply to Dartmouth over the years is that, frankly, they have a couple of interests in mind when they come here. They think they might know what they want to major in, and they'll probably change their mind over time here. So there are some students who enroll at Dartmouth knowing what they want to major in, they stick with it, they go all the way through. But more students arrive here with a couple of ideas in mind and then zero in on it over time. So when we review your application, to be honest, we often don't notice the major that a student has indicated unless it has a real impact on the candidacy. So the student who's drawn towards the sciences and engineering but hasn't been a successful math student, that's something we're probably going to notice. The student who's drawn towards the sciences and that's just been a real area of strength for them, maybe we're going to notice that. But for most students, the role of the particular major in the decision is pretty minimal unless it really is important to you and impacts your case. Julia asks if she can send an extra resume to fit other extracurriculars that weren't captured in the Common App. So what advice do we give about extra resumes?
Yeah, and that's a great question because we certainly see a lot of variation in the way that students present their extracurricular activities. I would say an extra resume is fine, but with a caveat. We really don't want pages and pages of additional information about your activities, because to us it's hard for us to get a sense of what's really been most important. So I do understand that on the Common App, sometimes it's really hard to kind of distill or simplify everything that you've done over the course of 3.5 years of high school and probably longer for things that you've been involved in for longer than high school into those nice, neat little boxes. So I think a very succinct resume where maybe you say if community service is something that you've really been engaged in for a very, very long time, you don't list out every single activity or organization or cause that you've supported, but you summarize that in some sort of bullet points and say, I've spent this number of years, these are the kinds of things I've done. That's fine. That does help us to get a sense of the breadth and depth of your activity. So rather than 5 to 10 pages, if you can summarize it in 1 to 2 pages, almost like a job interview, right? You kind of keep that resume concise and to the point. That does provide us with another way of understanding what's been most important to you. So whether you take the Common App boxes or do a supplemental resume, again, start with what's most important and then work from there.
Yeah, and with an additional resume, if you submit one, a couple of things to keep in mind. still fill out the common application
Right.
boxes. Those are very helpful to us.
Right.
We're going to read a lot of applications over the course of the winter, and being able to follow those boxes provides some structure for us. And then if you can upload a resume with the common application, so that's the easiest way to go at this. You can use that additional space piece in the common application if you want to sort of format that as a resume. Those are two easy ways to go at it. If for some reason you need to submit a resume separate from filing the common application online, again, you can go to our website. There's instructions there for submitting extra materials, and there's an email address you can email it to. But the easiest thing is just to upload it with the common application if you want to do that. Danny's asking about an additional essay. Would it be read? What would we do with it? And same sort of thing. I think the important thing here is to be concise. If it's something that's really important and that you need to explain, I think doing it in that extra space of the common application is appropriate. And you just don't want it to be longer than a normal common application essay, and probably it should be shorter. It should probably be more concise than that.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. The couple, it sounds like on the chat there are a bunch of questions coming up about likely letters, and folks are curious about likely letters and when they're sent out and how we use them,
Yeah.
so we should
Sure.
address that.
Yeah, and I guess kind of given the season that we're in, maybe we can use a metaphor or an analogy with the season. So you can see that there's something wrapped, and maybe it's under a tree or on a desk or a table, or maybe it's your birthday, and you can see that there's a little envelope for you there, but you can't open it until that special day. And in this case, what is our mail date? April 1st or March 31st? I should know that.
It's we should have known this
We should
before
have
we
known
came
this.
online. It's March 31st,
March 31st.
or April 1st, and
Yeah.
one of those 2 days.
We'll make sure you know. So think about, there's something waiting for you. Just can't open it, but chances are it's something that you're going to be really excited about. So for us, we know that the process from January 1st until March 31st or April 1st is a very long one. And actually, if you think about all the time and energy you've invested in visiting colleges, visiting websites, talking to counselors, parents, friends, anyone who'll listen about your college list, this is something that I think most of you have probably been thinking about for quite some time, and probably are ready to have it resolved. And as we begin the reading process and regular decision, there are some candidates who surface pretty quickly who we are very excited that they're in our applicant pool, and we will send what we call a likely letter, which just gives them a heads up that we've read their application and we're excited that they are in our applicant pool. One of the really important things to know is that we will admit many students who do not receive one of these
Right.
little likely letters from us. It's very much calendar driven, and the way that our applicant pool has exploded, we are not able to get through every single application before we start sending these likely letters. So if you don't get a letter, it doesn't mean that you will not be admitted to Dartmouth, but for some small number of candidates at the beginning of the process who surface very, very quickly as really interesting and for us, kinds of students we'd like to see at Dartmouth, we will send out an early letter that just says, relax, this will resolve itself very nicely, and we're excited that you are considering Dartmouth very seriously.
Right. Great. A quick answer to Caesar's question. Caesar's asking about when he can check his application status online. After you submit your application, you'll receive an acknowledgement from us via email. It will give you instructions on how to use our online applicant services page, and you'll get a username and a PIN so that you can log in. For the most of the month of January, that online applicant services page will simply say, we're still processing materials. We will let you know if your application is incomplete. And then late in January or into February, once we know we've really caught up with all the processing and that everything's squared away, we'll update that online applicant services page so that it has a checklist on there, and we'll tell you what pieces of your application are there. At that same time that we update the checklist, you'll get an email from us saying, oh, this is missing, it's incomplete. But we try to make sure we can get all the processing done. We don't want to tell you that your secondary school hasn't submitted your report if they already have, and we're just trying to match it up to the application. So you've got time before we really confirm for you what's here and what's not, but you'll have that login as soon as you apply, and you'll be able to have that information. JJ's asking about being an international applicant.
Yeah.
So are international applicants evaluated separately from U.S. applicants, or are all applicants part of the same pool?
Yeah, well, JJ, let's see, it was almost 3, maybe 4 years ago, Dartmouth made the decision to be fully need blind in its admissions process for all applicants, including international applicants. Prior to that time, international applicants did have to be evaluated separately in the later stages of the admissions process because we were not fully need blind. But today, as we've been for the last 3 or 4 years, we are fully need blind for all of our applicants. And so that means that international applicants are evaluated in the same manner as our U.S. citizens. So just like we do for all students, we take a look at your information. We never concern ourselves with your ability to pay, and we make our decisions based upon all you've accomplished, your potential, and what we see that you bring to the Dartmouth community. Right.
And we think about the context, as we would for any applicant, of where you live, what are your access to resources, and let's focus on testing for a second. We try to contextualize what role testing should play in your application. If you've submitted the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language, and that helps us better understand your language abilities, we use that and roll that in, and we recognize that there may be things that influence how you perform on those standardized tests. Is English spoken at home? What's the language of instruction? So we take those things into account, but we're not separating you out into a separate pool around financial aid or those kinds of issues. Let's see. Quick answer to, I don't know who this question came from. Do we have to send in our AP scores officially or just self-report? You can self-report your AP scores, and we'll factor those in. If you're admitted to Dartmouth, you'll have to report them directly from the College Board, so you want to make sure that you report them accurately now, so that when we get the official report from this College Board, it matches up exactly to what you've told us earlier. But you can self-report those, and then you should report your official test scores through ACT or through the College Board, the SAT scores, the subject test scores. Question from M. Does applying later hurt my chances of being admitted? What if I didn't apply early decision because of concerns about wanting to compare financial aid packages? So, if somebody files their application on December 30th, is that different than applying on December 10th?
Yeah. Well, no difference from our perspective in terms of the timing, unless you are very late in January filing your application. So again, as we said at the outset, get your part of the application in as close to January 1st, ideally no later than January 1st. And then we'll be all set. In terms of this dilemma between early decision and regular decision, and we had an earlier question about that, but maybe it's good to just reiterate our commitment to preserving enough spaces for our regular decision applicants. We know that many students aren't ready to make the binding commitment to Dartmouth. It's not that they don't love the institution, and it's not because they don't see themselves being successful students here, but there are some important considerations, and financial aid is one of them, where they and their family feel they're just not ready to sign on the dotted line, so that if they were admitted, they would be committing themselves to matriculate. And so they decide to wait till regular decision. So we, as I said at the outset, have set aside many, many places because we recognize that our regular decision pool will be full of very talented students from a diverse array of backgrounds and perspectives and experiences. And those are just the kinds of students we'd like to include in the Dartmouth community. So it doesn't hurt your chances of being admitted, and we recognize that not all students are ready on November 1st to say Dartmouth is my clear first choice. Right.
I'm going to answer a question from DKM 525, and then I'm going to let Maria prepare to answer a question from NOLA about how we make decisions. Will Dartmouth accept a lot of students from one school, or is there a cutoff? Nobody ever believes us when we tell them this, but no, there is not a cutoff. And when we make admissions decisions, we're trying as best we can to make admissions decisions based on that individual candidate. So what we try not to do is we don't try to stack you up against the students from your high school and compare you just back and forth with them. We're trying to think about where you fit in the big applicant pool. What do you bring to Dartmouth? What rises up? What are you excited about? We don't cut off the numbers. We don't overmanage around the group in your school and say, gosh, if we have this many applicants, we can only take this many students. We just try not to do that, and we try to avoid that as much as we can. We're lucky at Dartmouth that geography doesn't really play a big role in how we make admissions decisions, because the applicant pool school is already geographically diverse. So we're able to really have a lot of freedom about saying, you know, this is a great student, and the state they come from shouldn't really impact negatively or positively. We've got enough diversity in the applicant pool geographically that we don't have to worry about that. So it shouldn't limit the numbers you have from your school. And one quick, without naming the school, I can tell you that there's a school that I've known for a long time. I've worked in admissions for 20 years, and about 5 years ago, 29 students applied from this high school. Large public high school outside a major metropolitan area in the northeastern United States.
That's narrowing it down, Dan.
So that school, 28 or 29 students applied 4 or 5 years ago, and I think we admitted 9 or 10 students. Yeah. The bad news is that the next year, 28 or 29 students applied, and I think we admitted 2. And then the following year, maybe 23 or 24 students applied, and we admitted 5 or 6. So, you know, it changed each year according to the students who applied. So now Maria gets to answer the big question here.
Yes.
from NOLA. How do we make decisions? Is there a committee? You want to talk a little bit about how often we read, how many applications we read?
Yeah. And that really gets at the heart of the work that we do. And we've just spent, we've gone through the early decision process, and we met as a staff just last week to talk about how we will approach the pretty daunting task of the regular decision review process, just given the volume of applications that we receive. And there are a couple of key points that I hope folks keep in mind about our approach to evaluating applications. The first is individualized review. So almost kind of taking off from what Dan was saying about from a particular school, we think of you as an individual. We don't look at you and say, gosh, there are 23 students from this high school, we're only going to admit 2, and the rest of them won't even have a shot. You are an individual. You are not a part of a group or other than your own community from which you're applying in terms of the context of your individual application. But we very much value an approach that says you're an individual. We think about you in the context of our entire applicant pool, which is why we might in one year take 12 students from the high school, and the next year only take 2. You're not competing against your classmates sitting next to you in that AP Bio class or that AP Stats class. You're competing in the broader international Dartmouth applicant pool as an individual. We approach this process with no preconceived notions. We see this as a process of discovery. We don't look at the application and think, oh, okay, I can see what kind of category the student might fall into, or I've seen lots of students who have the set of activities or set of grades. We don't approach it that way. You're a unique individual, and we're trying to figure out who you are as that individual and how you differ from the other students in the pool this year. So the first part is this commitment to an individualized review. The second kind of fundamental cornerstone of our review process is what we call holistic review. And we've talked about test scores, we've talked about peer evaluations, we've talked about recommendations, and we've talked about essays. I think we talked about grades. If we haven't, we will soon. But all of those things we require as part of our application. We do that so that we get a holistic sense of you. That is, who are you as an entire person? Not just a transcript, not just scores, not just a resume, not just essays, but as an entire whole. And we value all those pieces. And I think, as Dan said earlier in this broadcast, each piece is going to be weighed differently depending upon your strengths, your accomplishments, your weaknesses, the context of your school, of your home community. But it's important for us to see you as a whole and not just as one slice, just your scores or just your resume, just your essay. So those two things, individualized review and holistic review, are real cornerstones of our application process. We have a very reading-intensive process where, as a staff, we're going to be reading maybe 150 applications per week. Right. So that's a pretty good clip. It's not quite 40 hours a week of reading, but it's pretty darn close. And so we invest a great deal of our time and energy into reading every single application. Once every application has been read once, we begin to make some preliminary decisions. Some applications do float up pretty quickly because in the estimation of the admissions officer who read that file, the applicant is exceptional for any of a number of reasons. It's not always the highest scores or the perfect GPA, but something about the way all those pieces came together spoke to that admissions officer and said, this is someone we'd like to see at Dartmouth. Not many candidates jump out or jump off the page or off the computer screen on that first read. There are some number of candidates who, after one read, really we're pretty certain that they are not prepared to be academically successful. The good news for Dartmouth is that there aren't many students who fall into that category, but there will be some small number of students who really don't have the fundamental academic foundation that reassures us that they're ready to be successful students here. The vast majority of our candidates really fall into this sort of possible category where they've demonstrated academic success, they have been engaged members of their community, they've contributed in very positive ways, and so all the signs point to someone who would be a successful and contributing member of the Dartmouth community. So that's where the real work begins. We'll have additional rounds of reading where those files will be sent to a different admissions officer who does an independent read. So without knowing what the first reader recommended, a second person will start from the beginning of your application and come to some set of decisions or recommendations about what they think are your strengths and how they see you contributing to Dartmouth. So we'll go round and round with reading pretty much through January and February. As we get towards March, there will be some small group of candidates where we may decide to meet as a small committee or break up into small committees to discuss, because we think in those cases we would benefit from more perspectives on that candidate as we work towards a final decision. So unlike some schools that have a very committee-heavy selection process, ours really is based on a couple of independent reads and then some decision-making based upon where readers came out in evaluating those applications, and then we work from there. And again, Dan, you and I have read a lot of applications. You have, I'm sure, a lot of perspective to add in terms of how you read files.
When we typically start, as Maria said, it's very intensive, and every admissions officer who's reading an application is going to start with your part of the application. So they open up the file and they start with the personal part of the application. They progress through to the information that your school sends us, so your school profile, a secondary school report, a high school transcript, and then they move from that piece of the application to how other people view you in the process. So the teacher recommendations, the peer evaluation, the interview if there's an interview, all of those different pieces come together. And that's pretty much the progression each time we read. As Maria mentioned, most applications will be read 2 or 3 times. Maybe there'll be further conversation through the committee process. And as new information comes into the application, in between that first reading and second reading process, it gets picked up. And then again, between the second read and the third read, it gets picked up into the file. So that as we're going along, we're trying to give multiple perspectives, individualized review, and this holistic process of progressing from reading what you have to tell us to what your school has to tell us to how other people view you. So a couple questions here. We've got a notification on our screen here that makes it so that I can't read all the comments that are coming up. So what's the most, let's go with how many people get waitlisted, because that's one I can actually see, and then I'm going to stand up here and try to fix what we're getting in the background.
Well, it will depend. The number of students that are waitlisted really depends on the applicant pool itself. And one of the most challenging things about working in a selective college admissions office is that we will turn away, in Dartmouth's case, probably 90% of the students who apply. And that's really tough, because clearly we could fill our class many times over with all the students who have presented to us academic information, personal information that, again, suggests that they would be wonderful members of our community and would be successful students and contributing members of the Dartmouth community. So we do put some number of students on our wait list. It's ranged from, as our pool has gotten larger, I would say 1,600 to 1,700 students end up on the wait list. This year we'll have to wait and see, no pun intended, but to see what the pool looks like and what we think is the right number. But we find it very, very difficult to turn away so many students, and so we hope to be able to admit some students from the wait list every year, and so we'll identify a relatively small group, given the overall size of our pool, who will be waitlisted.
Right. And it's typically fewer than 10% of the applicants. In fact, typically it's been significantly fewer than 10% of the applicants. About half of those students will indicate an interest in staying on the waiting list. And then as we move forward, it's very hard for us to predict. In fact, it's impossible for us to predict whether we'll use a waiting list or not in a given year. There have been years over the last 10 where we haven't been able to use the waiting list, and then there have been years where we've admitted 50 or 60 or 70 students. So it varies a little bit from year to year. I've fixed the problem we've had with our screen here, so we'll go back to some of the questions we've had. I'm going to answer a question from Nick about family members who've attended Dartmouth. Does Dartmouth take into consideration that if family members have attended Dartmouth? And we do. What we particularly track and what our bosses ask us about are sons and daughters of alumni who attended Dartmouth. And we take that into account as we read an application. It's somebody has a relationship with the college. They trust us enough that they've allowed their son or daughter to apply to the college. We should probably factor that in and take that into account. In a sea of very qualified applicants with high-achieving students who've applied, it can be one of those things that helps us distinguish a candidacy. It can be one of those things that we factor into the review process. And again, it's one of many pieces that swirl around in an application. So it doesn't change the course of the application, but it helps us say, well, here's something we ought to consider and take into account. And again, the number we best sort of know and that we best understand are those who are sons and daughters of alumni, because that's the one that we can track and sort of take into account historically. Senior year. Somebody's asking about senior grades and the mid-year report. Can they give up now and not work hard anymore? What do we do with senior grades when they come in?
Yeah, well, most of you are probably close to finishing your first semester. Some of you probably have already finished your first trimester. So those senior grades are going to be really, really important. So no letting up at this point. Usually schools send us the mid-year report, I would say, 3rd week of January, 4th week of January. We're probably getting some trimester grades at this point in the process. And so those very much are going to be considered along with your 9th through 11th grade grades. And so absolutely keep on doing the great work that you're doing. It is important to us to see that you are able to sustain that high level of academic achievement, or if you've been on an upward trajectory. We like to see students who continue in that upward trajectory. So we will take a close look at the mid-year grades or first trimester grades when those are received and added to your file.
Right. So we're coming to the end of our time. Our producers are telling us that we should be wrapping up and getting to the final questions here. A couple of reminders for you. Use the website dartmouth.edu/admissions, both to learn more about Dartmouth. This chat and other past chats are posted online on the site. There are blogs. There's a lot of information on there about the college. There's also a lot of practical information about the application process. So go to the website, use that information. There are some checklists and some helpful guidelines there about submitting information. The regular decision deadline is January 1st, so be sure to pay attention to that. Don't forget to relax a little bit. If you are lucky enough to have a break from school over these next couple of weeks, we hope you get some rest and you get a chance to take advantage of that. And then I don't know, is there anything you want to leave folks with in terms of what's the most important thing we think about or what we wrestle with as we make decisions?
You know, I think a lot of people, if you ask advice, what should I do? What's the most important thing for me to convey in my application? You're going to hear a lot of the same thing, which is just be yourself.
Right.
You are a special person. You are an interesting person. You are a unique individual. I know it sounds kind of like Sesame Street a little bit, but it's true. As a parent, both Dan and I are parents, and we know that you are all unique and interesting. You have reasons why you do things. You have likes and dislikes. Don't be afraid to share that with us, because that's how we get to know you. As I said before, we don't have the opportunity to meet you face to face, but through your part of the essay, the things that you can control, we learn a little bit more about you as a unique individual. So I would say the most important thing, sure, the grammar and spelling of your essays are things that you should pay attention to, but beyond that, don't be afraid to just show us who you are. Because who you are is what we're interested in.
That's right. You can't reinvent yourself. You have a record to rest on and share with us play to your strengths and share with us your interests. We hope this has been helpful. This has gone really quickly for us. So again, dartmouth.edu/admissions. There's a lot of information in there about how to contact us and how to ask, how to submit materials. And good luck with the application process.
And I guess the other thing we should say is our office will be closed on the 24th through January 3rd. If you have any problems with the Common Application, there's tons of resources at the commonapp.org website. They've got online help and resources. So We won't be able to answer any of your questions if you're having trouble submitting, but please, we encourage you to be in touch with the folks at Common App. I know they staff up pretty significantly because for them, their biggest days are December 30th, 31st, and January 1st.
Right.
So they want to make sure that you're not stressing about the technology and about hitting that submit button. So as Dan said, we want you to rest and enjoy this break. And we appreciate your interest in Dartmouth and wish you the best in this holiday season.
Thanks a lot.